Lieutenant William W. Cooke, of course. While much is known about Lieutenant William W. Cooke as the author of the famous Last Message at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, one of the most intriguing and lesser-known aspects of his life involves his nationality, his motive for joining the U.S. Army, and a fascinating historical what-if. Lieutenant William W. Cooke was Canadian, and he initially came to the United States to fight against it, not for it. A Canadian by birth, he was not a natural-born American citizen. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, a group of Irish-American veterans known as the Fenian Brotherhood planned an audacious scheme. Their goal was to seize Canadian territory, then British North America, to use as leverage to force Great Britain to grant independence to Ireland. Cooke fought for the Fenians. In 1866, the Fenians launched a series of raids across the border into Canada. The young William Cooke, then about 20 years old, crossed the border and joined the Fenian forces as a private. He participated in the Battle of Ridgeway, a significant skirmish where the Fenians actually achieved a temporary victory over Canadian militia units. The twist of fate. The Fenian raid collapsed quickly due to political pressure, and the U.S. government moving to stop them. The Fenian army disbanded and retreated back across the border. Rather than returning to Canada, Cooke decided to stay in the United States. The irony: the man who would become a decorated officer in the U.S. 7th Cavalry, an emblem of the American Old West, began his military career by taking up arms against the nation he would later die for. He was, in his first military action, an invader of the United States' northern neighbor. This reveals that Cooke's primary drive was adventure and military life itself, not necessarily a pre-existing patriotism for the United States. His loyalty was earned through his subsequent service, a historical what-if. Had the Fenian raids been successful, or had Cooke returned to Canada, he would never have enlisted in the U.S. Army. The famous Last Message from the Little Bighorn would have been written by someone else, and the name W. W. Cooke would be a mere footnote in the history of Irish nationalist movements in Canada. This early chapter of his life is often completely overshadowed by his service with Custer and his dramatic death. It paints a much more complex picture of Cooke as a transnational figure, an adventurer, and a man whose destiny was shaped by a failed, almost forgotten border conflict. While Lieutenant William W. "Billy" Cooke is famously known as the tall, mutton-chopped adjutant who scribbled Custer's final orders at the Little Bighorn, one of the most poignant and lesser-known secrets about him involves his distinctive appearance and the heartbreaking story behind it. Cooke was instantly recognizable by his extraordinary flowing side whiskers, which were known as Dundrearies or Piccadilly Weepers. They were so long and prominent that they were a defining feature, often mentioned by his contemporaries. The secret is that these whiskers were not merely a fashion statement or a mark of vanity. They were a tangible promise to a woman he loved. Cooke was engaged to a woman named Jean Corbin, who lived back in his native Canada. According to the lore and family tradition, Jean adored his whiskers and made him promise that he would not cut them until they were reunited and married. He kept that promise through the Civil War and through a decade of service on the western frontier, his whiskers growing ever more distinctive as a symbol of his devotion and his anticipation of a future life away from the Army. Cooke died on Last Stand Hill, and when the burial party arrived days later, his body was identified primarily by his famous whiskers, as he had no other distinguishing wounds. But the story doesn't end there. Upon his death, a lock of his hair, undoubtedly from those very whiskers, was cut off and sent back to his family in Canada. It was a common, if macabre, Victorian practice to create mourning jewelry from the hair of the deceased. This lock of hair, a relic of the promise he never got to keep, exists to this day. It is preserved in a museum in his hometown of Mount Pleasant, Ontario, a silent and poignant testament to the personal life and lost future of the man with the most famous whiskers in the 7th Cavalry. So, while history remembers Lieutenant Cooke as the bearer of Custer's last message, his personal secret was that his most famous physical feature was a lover's token, a promise of a peaceful future that was erased on a Montana hillside. Myleskeogh, of course. While much of Myleskeogh's life is documented, one of the most fascinating and lesser-known secrets isn't about his death at the Little Bighorn, but about an object he carried and the incredible, almost prophetic, story of his horse. Before coming to America to fight in the Civil War, Myleskeogh was a soldier of fortune in the Papal States, fighting to defend the Vatican from Giuseppe Garibaldi's forces in 1860. For his service, Pope Pius IX awarded him the Pro Petri Sede Medal for the See of Peter and the Medaglia di Pro Petri Sede, two of the highest papal military honors. Keogh cherished these medals. He had one of them, the Pro Petri Sede Medal, mounted and wore it on a chain around his neck under his uniform for the rest of his life. When his body was found on the battlefield at the Little Bighorn in 1876, he was one of the few soldiers not mutilated by the victorious Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. This was a sign of respect often granted to a foe who had fought with exceptional bravery. While the exact reason is unknown, many historians and contemporaries believe the warriors saw the papal medal around his neck. They may have recognized it as a sacred or medicine object, a powerful totem that marked him as a man protected by or in communion with the Great Spirit, or Wakantanka, in their own tradition. They left the medal on his body. This small, hidden object, a token from a war on another continent 16 years earlier, likely played the final, crucial role in ensuring his body was treated with honor by his enemies. It's a profound and little-known detail that connects the battlefields of Italy to the plains of Montana through the life of one man. You often hear that Comanche was the only survivor of the Little Bighorn. This is a simplification, but the truly unknown secret is why Comanche specifically became so famous. While several U.S. cavalry horses were captured by the native warriors, Comanche was found badly wounded 2 days after the battle. He was nursed back to health and, due to his wounds, was officially retired with orders that he never be ridden again. Comanche wasn't even Keogh's primary horse for most of his career. Keogh had a renowned and favorite horse named Paddy that he rode throughout the Civil War and many Indian campaigns. Comanche was actually his secondary, less famous mount. Paddy had gone lame and was left behind at the fort during the Little Bighorn campaign. So, the most famous horse in American military history, the sole symbol of survival from Custer's last stand, was essentially the backup horse. The historical spotlight fell on Comanche by a twist of fate, Captain Thomascuster. Of course. While George Armstrong Custer is a household name, his younger brother, Thomas Ward Custer, led a life of incredible and often overlooked audacity. One of the most profound and lesser-known secrets about him isn't about his life, but about the grim fate of his body after his death at the Little Bighorn. The well-known fact is that Thomas Custer was the first U.S. soldier to be awarded 2 Medals of Honor, both for capturing Confederate battle flags during the Civil War, a feat of almost unimaginable bravery. The unknown secret is what the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, who held a special enmity for him, did to his corpse. A ritualistic mutilation beyond the norm. While mutilation of the dead was not uncommon in the brutal warfare of the plains, what happened to Tom Custer was uniquely severe and symbolic. He was so hated by the victorious warriors that he was specifically targeted for posthumous vengeance. The Ears Incident. It's widely reported that his body was found badly mutilated. However, a specific and credible account comes from the Lakota warrior Little Knife. He stated that a Cheyenne woman, Moving Robe Woman, also known as Mary Crawler, who was fighting to avenge her brother's death, sought out Tom Custer's body. Using a sewing awl from her decorative pouch, she punctured his eardrums. Her reason, as told, was so that he might hear better in the afterlife, a deeply sarcastic and spiritual punishment for a man who, in the native view, had not listened to their pleas and had been an aggressive pursuer in previous campaigns. The scalp that wasn't taken. Most soldiers were scalped. Tom Custer's head, however, was flayed to the point of being unrecognizable. The skin of his head and face was removed in a single piece, almost like a mask. The reason for this extreme act is believed to be that the warriors knew of his 2 medals of honor and his reputation. By destroying his face so utterly, they were not just taking a trophy, they were erasing his identity and denying him recognition in the afterlife. It was the ultimate insult. The tattoo. Perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence used to identify his otherwise unrecognizable body was a small personal tattoo. He had his initials, TWC, comma, tattooed on the inside of one of his arms. The mutilation was so extensive that this small, intimate marking became the primary way the burial detail was able to confirm which body was his. Why the special hatred? Thomascuster was not just another soldier. He was his brother's most trusted and aggressive lieutenant. He had fought fiercely against the Plains tribes in the Washita campaign and elsewhere. The warriors saw him as the Little Custer, a ruthless and effective extension of his brother's will. His famous bravery, celebrated by the U.S. Army, was seen as brutal arrogance by his enemies. So, the unknown thing about Captain Thomas Custer is the degree and intent behind the desecration of his body. It wasn't random battlefield violence. It was a targeted ritualistic act meant to punish his soul, erase his identity, and serve as poetic justice for a man they considered deaf to their plight. His fate on that hillside is a dark testament to how fiercely he was both respected and reviled by his adversaries. Major Marcusreno. A disgraceful end, Reno died in 1889 of cancer following a court-martial and dismissal from the Army for drunkenness and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a Washington, D.C. cemetery, a fittingly obscure end for a man many in the Army and the public blamed for Custer's defeat. A secret campaign for rehabilitation. For decades, Reno's son, Robert, and a few supporters waged a quiet campaign to clear his father's name. They argued he was a scapegoat and that his actions on the hilltop, while not heroic, were a rational attempt to save his command from annihilation. The covert exhumation. In 1934, the Army's Judge Advocate General reviewed the case and concluded Reno had been unfairly treated. The Army approved his reburial with full military honors at the Custer battlefield. To avoid public controversy and protests from Custer's still powerful supporters, the exhumation and transfer were done in absolute secrecy. His remains were disinterred from the D.C. cemetery without any public notice. On September 9, 1934, Marcusreno was reburied at the Custer Battlefield National Cemetery, now Custer National Cemetery. The ceremony was small and discreet. The man who spent his life haunted by Custer's shadow was laid to rest forever on the very ground that defined his legacy, a final secret act of partial rehabilitation by the U.S. Army. So the secret isn't about the battle itself, but about its long, cold aftermath. The man vilified in life was, decades after his death, covertly dug up and given a place of honor among the very men he was accused of failing. A quiet admission by the institution that had cast him out. Captain Frederick Benteen. A deep personal and publicly unacknowledged tragedy haunted Benteen for over 2 decades. The mysterious death of his first wife, Catherine Kate Norman Benteen. A seemingly happy marriage. Benteen married Kate in 1862. By all accounts, it was a loving marriage, and they had a son. A sudden and mysterious death. In October 1866, while Benteen was stationed at Fort Dodge, Kansas, Kate died suddenly. The official cause of death was listed as typhoid pneumonia. However, the circumstances were highly suspicious and fueled immediate rumors. The open secret among officers and their wives was that Kate did not die of natural causes. The widespread belief was that she had committed suicide by taking poison. The motivation for this alleged suicide was the even darker rumor that Benteen's own harsh treatment and neglect had driven her to it. Benteen's silent agony. Benteen was utterly devastated. He wrote to his father that her death was a thunderclap from a cloudless sky, and that life has lost its chief charm for me. He never publicly addressed the rumors of suicide or his role in it. This tragedy became the private, painful core of his existence, a wound that never healed. Just over a year later, Benteen married Kate's cousin, Jeannie. While this may have been a practical move to care for his motherless son, it further fueled gossip and speculation among his peers, who saw it as confirmation of his callousness or an attempt to quickly cover up a scandal. This personal catastrophe is the key to understanding Benteen's famously acidic and cynical personality. The man who held a grudge against Custer for his actions at the Washita River was also a man consumed by a private grief and public shame. His bitterness wasn't just military, it was deeply personal. The loss of Kate, under a cloud of suspicion that he could never clear, likely shaped the resentful and uncooperative officer who hesitated so fatally when he received Custer's desperate plea for help at the Little Bighorn. Benteen was likely the source of the most damning and enduring smear against Custer's character, which he delivered not in an official report, but in a private anonymous letter to a newspaper. The Secret Act. In 1878, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat published a series of scathing anonymous letters from a source calling himself A. Stan Patter, or one who thirsts for knowledge. These letters viciously attacked Custer's military competence and, most damningly, his personal character. Historians and biographers like Frederick D. Poundstone and Charles K. Mills have extensively analyzed the letters and overwhelmingly concluded that the author was Frederick Benteen. The evidence is compelling. The author had an insider's knowledge of the 7th Cavalry's movements, personalities, and specific incidents that only a high-ranking officer like Benteen would know. The vitriolic tone, the specific grievances, especially the Washita incident, and the unique, sarcastic writing style match Benteen's known correspondence and personality perfectly. His secret was not a single event, but a lifelong burden of grief, guilt, and the silent accusation of his peers, which made him one of the most complex and tragic figures in the 7th Cavalry.